Their Fated Travels. Chapter 25. To Nuln by Barge, Part 2. Extract from the Diary of Rysandria, Day 100. I was standing on the deck admiring the view outside when something shocking came to my attention. Over on the riverbank I was facing, some way ahead, was a scene of slaughter. A caravan party with bodies surrounding it lay dead over the way. Many of the trees in the copse that ran along the bank were scarred and hacked, as if a group of violent-minded people had passed that way. The boxes of goods they carried were fine cloth. I could see this as one of them had been busted open, revealing its contents. They had left that too. Then the truth of the matter was revealed. High above the barge, on an overhanging rock that jutted out from the mountainside above the river, a wild-eyed, bloodshot beast-man peered over, watching the approaching vessel beneath. He gave a sharp hand signal and guttural commands to a nearby Gor, who held a rowing boat's oar in his hand. He quickly wedged the paddle end of it underneath a large nearby boulder, with the help of two more Gors pushing it with their hands. The maddened beast-man too resembled the Gor, yet he looked like so much more as well. The veins beneath his skin stood up on end. He breathed heavily at all times, and dried blood was clearly visible down his front and chin, originating, it seemed, from his mouth. He had been once a Gor, but now he was something else. Talag Grorf now commanded this troop. A force of beast-men, he had once been an infantry fighter within. He barked a new order to the side of the wide ledge. 15 Ungors quickly took their positions, with bows at the ready, while the Gors pushed the boulder to the very edge. Then the troops waited for his signal. Soon the barge was in the right location, and he gave the order to fire. The Ungors shot their arrows over the edge, and let gravity bring their plummet into an awful missile barrage. Rysandria was standing next to a marine, one of the posted guards that would attend such barges. They had been chatting about faith and life's bigger meanings when the sky above them darkened suddenly. They looked up just in time to see a hail of arrows come down upon them. One arrow lodged into the collarbone of the man Rysandria had been speaking to. Another arrow had landed close to Rysandria, too close. It had pinned her robe to the deck through the bottom flowing part that met the floor. She tugged at the material and pulled it free with a sharp tearing sound. Next the Shallian turned her attention to the injured man as the alarms began sounding. Shots and screams could be heard clearly. A terrible voice carried on the wind, inciting some dark command in a language nobody present could understand. Nobody conscious, that was. A dead passenger, a woman in her 20s, was carried along the deck by an already grieving man. Her arrow wound bled profusely where the man had already removed it. Rysandria looked around, trying to assess the injured and those who could be saved. The casualties were not many, at least. Suddenly a new hail of arrows came down, raining around the passengers and crew, but taking no casualties this time, except for a crewman who had an arrow scrape down his cheek, making it bleed deeply. The screaming commotion brought others from below, onto the deck to see what all the hubbub was. The sea marines were ready, weapons in hand, shouting orders back and forth for defensive positions to be set up and maintained. Suddenly there was a crashing sound, as a falling, screaming Ungor plummeted into the deck, smashing cargo and rigging with his descent. His body was crushed against the now split plank boards. This Ungor had been unfortunate enough to miss twice with his bow, hitting only water, giving Talach Grorf all the excuse he needed to dish out what he saw as a fitting punishment for negligence in action. Again his wild cry sounded, and again the arrows fired. The captain of the vessel was looking up from his cabin in distress as his first mate was giving him a report of what was happening out there. The captain quickly turned the barge to the starboard, and it pressed against the bank with great power. This was a timely action, as the next hail of arrows landed soon after. Only 2 of them had made contact with the barge, thudding into the wood planks harmlessly. The war-gore cried in triumph at his foe doing exactly what he had wanted them to. He gave the command at once, and the Gores hauled the boulder as hard as they could. They were pushing and pushing, but for some reason the boulder did not topple over the edge, simply choosing to shift weight back towards them as they stopped pushing. Talarg was not impressed, and screamed wildly at the Gores, who renewed their efforts suddenly. Even this fearful expression of energy on their parts was not enough to shift the huge rock. It suddenly became clear why this was happening. An outgrowing tree had sprouted out from the mountainside and was stopping the boulder from rolling forwards properly. Talarg peered threateningly over the edge once more, seeing the barge was about to pass out of range for the planned aerial attack. Failure was unacceptable to Talarg. He had suffered defeats before, back when he was a normal Gore, but since his newfound strength of status, he knew no defeat whatsoever. He was not about to start now. The growling war-Gore watched the Gores struggling with the root to push the boulder around it somehow, while one of them hacked desperately at the small tree to chop it off. Ineffective, thought Talarg, who walked purposely up to the Gores, looked at them a final time, and kicked the one currently pushing the boulder at that moment, a great kick which connected with the entire bottom of his hoof. The impact was harder than any kick had a right to be, snapping the small outcropping tree and pushing the boulder, Gore and all, over the edge into a plummet below. Tordrad, Tobias, Dieter and Olga had now joined Rysandria on deck. Maestro was still out cold, but Rysandria wasn't so concerned about him. She had given the wizard a quick medical inspection earlier under the watchful gaze of Angelique. The Shallion had put his unconscious state down to overexertion and recent stress. He would recover well, she knew. Plus he had been left in the capable, if rather large hands of the Sister of Sigmar, who stayed at the man's bedside praying for many an hour. On deck, Dieter looked up to see the falling boulder above. The others followed his gaze. Dieter calmly patted Olga and stated, "If we die, we die," before pulling his jacket up around his face to cover his head. Just then the huge boulder landed, hitting the very edge of the barge, almost capsizing it from the force and making it rock violently. Below deck, Angelique had ended up on top of the still unconscious Maestro as she peered down at him and said aloud to no one in particular, "Sigmar truly works towards this union, doesn't he, my love?" Above on deck, the barge was still mostly intact. The boulder had pulled some of it away, but there was no breach enough to spring a leak. It had been mostly cosmetic structural damage. The boulder bobbed in the water as if mocking them. There must have been some property within the rock, or air that kept it afloat even this long, considered Dieter. Rysandria praised Shalya. Tordrad praised Urson. Tobias grumbled and cursed, having been lurched backwards onto his back from the force of the blow. Olga growled defensively at the new scent approaching from above. Talarg Grorf had bounded forwards, his heart carrying his unnatural blood through his veins at an alarming rate, as he grabbed the 2 remaining Gores and jumped over the edge with one firmly in each hand. The 2 Gores screamed fearfully at their unexpected descent. Their war-Gore leader roared with the lust of battle ahead. He could taste it coming up, and he would let nothing step in its way. Talarg landed, his fall softened somewhat by the unfortunate Gores either side of him. Their bodies broke upon contact with the boulder, but their leader, who had still been gripping them, had perhaps been lucky with the equal distribution of force at his sides, and he landed on his hooves directly upon the boulder. Even with this small help, it was unlikely that any normal creature could survive such a jump, and thusly it was clear that Talarg was very special indeed. The maddened war-Gore let both Gores slip from his grasp into the deeps of the river below. before he bellowed a challenging war cry and leapt with all of his might. Within a blur of motion, the war-gore had made the jump from the boulder that had landed behind the barge and the vessel itself. Had he waited any longer to jump, he perhaps might not have made it, although that theory was in some doubt, considered Dieter, who observed how easily the man-beast had managed what was arguably a hard jump, making it look easy anyway. The crazed creature landed, his hooves making a clud sound on the deck. He simply stood there, his huge chest moving up and down as he breathed in the battle to come. He unfastened a huge polearm from his back. Its deadly range was drastically more than the eye could behold. As a passenger attempted to run, the war-gore swung the weapon outwards and struck the man through his shoulder with it. With a carefully precise yank motion, the blade tore the arm off. Guttural screams ensued from the victim, who stumbled away. Satisfied with the horror, Talach allowed him to do so. The crew's onboard weapons had been unlocked to allow the Marines access to them. A Marine raised a handgun, aiming at the great beast man. He calmed himself and fired with a dead-eye shot. The bullet did not strike its target in the way he had hoped, though. The beast man swirled the weapon in front of him, and there was a clanging spark sound as the bullet ricocheted off of the metal weapon head. Everyone gasped at this show of skill. Confidently, Talag strode towards the quivering Marine, who regained his senses in time to draw a sword. The weapon was quickly knocked out of his hand, even though he had struck with it. The beastman's reflexes were on a scale beyond imagination. The Marine ran from him and jumped overboard, screaming as he went. Tordrad saw this, and his face soured at this cowardice. He grabbed the only weapon at hand, a scimitar that lay nearby, and stepped forwards in determination. Rysandria walked behind him, ready to support as always. Lives were at stake, and she would do whatever was needed to save them. Dieter and Tobias sneaked forwards carefully to get into flanking positions as quietly as possible. 4 weeks ago. A bloodied copse not far from Nuln. An Empire threat response platoon was mopping up the last beastmen stragglers of those foolish enough to run amok, attacking some of the smaller settlements in the area. This band of beastmen was only one of several running rampant across the lands, so near to the city without being picked off, especially during a militarily busy time, that it was disquieting. Still, with this battle, the chain of command was now severed from the head of the troops, for Captain Anders' soldiers had at last found and killed the war-gore in charge. His head hung from the captain's horse already, chained up by the pierced ring that went through its entire nasal cavity. "No wonder we won," Anders had joked. "It probably couldn't see past that chunk of metal in its face." The men laughed in approval, as a release of the nervous energy that had built up in the face of the battle. Suddenly, Captain Anders became intrigued, as he saw what he had believed to be a corpse getting back up. A beastman gore who didn't look particularly spectacular, but a little more powerful than the others of the squad around him. Anders instinctively pegged this one as the chieftain, a unit champion. With a furious bellow, the gore commanded to the bodies about him. Several of them rose from the ground. This took the good captain by surprise, and he ran his hand along the feather in his helm, as he would often do, out of habit. These were not undead. These were simply beastmen who were badly injured and would have normally laid there until the Empire troops had gone, or until the soldiers killed them by stabbing the dead, just to be sure. It was common for troops to be put out of battle in this fashion, damage sustained, and the pain stopping one from arising, or sometimes going in and out of consciousness while bleeding badly. But for those around the Gore chieftain to arise on his command, this was something out of the ordinary. Anders glared at his intended target as it strode towards him, seemingly unaware of the head wounds it had sustained. The captain had his runner take his horse back out of the way as it was starting to spook, perhaps just from being in the presence of a true child of chaos. The chieftain closed in on the captain, bellowing a challenging word in its bestial dark tongue. The captain drew his sword in response. The other beastmen indeed waited back to allow this fight to take place. The chieftain picked up a bone cudgel from one of the dead of his kin and kept walking. As he did so, he threw the weapon at the captain's face. Such an act was so unexpected that Anders almost didn't dodge the improvised projectile in time. The chieftain, Talach Grorf, drew an axe. Anders was ready in case this too was thrown at him. It wasn't. Instead, the beastman reached him and melee battle began. The chieftain had a strong sense of battle skill, perhaps long honed over the years. His attacks were wild, but with the grace of balance enough to parry again from the captain's counter-attack. Already the captain's sword had been knocked aside, and he was open. The chieftain thrust the point of the weapon's head up to take him in the gut, but Anders brought his metal-clad boot across and kicked the axe against its flat part, redirecting the angle to miss him. It was then Anders' turn to be on the offensive. His speed was superb, forcing the Gore chieftain to backpedal defensively with flurry after flurry of attacks. Still the beastman retreated as Anders tested from every conceivable angle. It would not be long now, the captain knew. Already he had gashed the creature to the arm twice. It was a testament to its willpower that it had not dropped its axe, for one blow had slashed right down to its hand, opening a wound between his forefinger and thumb. Gripping the axe would now be agonizing. As the battle continued, with the humans stepping forwards every few blows and the beastman retreating, a strange darkness over them from the sky was impossible to miss. As if a rainy storm were due at an accelerated, unnatural rate. An explosive impacting sound off in the distance that made the ground about them tremor, not far from them, threatened to tear their attentions away from the battle they were in, but both fighters kept their enemy resolved before them. That did not stop the others of their respective groups from looking, though. Human and beastman alike stood and gawped in shock at the smoke rising up from the site of impact 2 miles away. They couldn't tell what it was, but something had fallen from the sky. As the two adversaries fought on, a new presence in the sky above them again was impossible to miss. Even though they dared give it much regard, a darkness began to grow as a large shadow formed over the two of them. Talach swiped his axe in a wide arc to buy himself room and chanced to look upwards at the calls of the growing shadow. He was in disbelief at the huge chunk of green stone that plummeted towards their very position. The captain almost had Talach's head off, but this time he jumped backwards just in time to avoid the fatal blow. Suddenly the beastman's hoof struck against the body of one of his own kin, and he fell over backwards with a crash, just as the warpstone meteorite hit their location, landing dead center upon the Empire captain, who had looked up at it and smiled darkly with acceptance of his cruel fate. As the large chunk of warpstone made contact, it killed the human outright and splintered immediately, with pieces firing off like shrapnel around it. The dust cloud and soil thrown up buried several of the fallen, both those dead and alive. Talag's rough leather armour tore open as warpstone flew at him. One particular shard entered his body perfectly, like a needle bullet. It punctured the beastman's heart and lay embedded there as the falling soil fell around him, burying him alive. There he lay for days on end, trying to dig his way out, but struggling, because the warpstone in his chest felt like it was killing him. For some reason, the wound had not been fatal. This warpstone had begun to mutate the area of its entry soon after contact. This effect had indeed resurrected the dead beastman's heart and forced it to beat against the will of all natural biological order. Still Talach lay there, slowly digging his way out. The only food was that of his own kin, the body he had tripped over. Had that mistaken battle actually saved his life, he wondered? Were he standing, what then would have happened? Was the shock perhaps lessened by him exposing less of himself to it on impact? That the body of his dead kin shielded him from much of the blast? For it had surely hit the corpse first. Whatever the reason was, though, he told himself that he was alive and his foe was dead. It was an intervention of the Chaos Gods, he was sure. It was a sign that he had been chosen to fulfill some great deed. The other beast-men, who had been similarly struck with pieces of the foul, tainted green stone, had also mutated somewhat, but none of these survived. Only Talarch would prove strong enough in body and will to dig his way out and be all the stronger for it. 4 weeks later, Talarch's polearm smashed against Tordrad once more. With no armour to protect him, he was prone. Already the Kislev-born warrior was bleeding in 3 places as Tobias and Dieter finally managed to attack. Ulga sunk his teeth into the war gore, but the creature brought his other hoof up and kicked the Doberman away, fracturing its face from the impact. It whined and pulled itself back up to a standing position as its master, Dieter, threw a bottle of pure alcohol at the beastman. It impacted with a clish, harmlessly against his armour. Every attack from Dieter, previously concealed scalpel, was dodged. Tobias let swing another stone from his sling. This time it had hit the beastman. Again he shook off the attack as if it were nothing, and kicked Tordrad hard to the chest, sending him sprawling across the deck. He cursed in his native tongue. Rysandria proclaimed, "I have never seen anyone do that to Tordrad. I fear this bodes ill for all of us." Together, Ulga and Tordrad charged, and Rysandria fired Redemption, the gun she carried. They had not bothered to search the Shallion, nor inquire for weapons, and hence she hadn't realized that weapons were not allowed, for it was unlike the order to carry weapons. The gunshot blazed out towards Talarch, again with a tail on it like a white comet. The war gore had seen it coming, though, and sidestepped, ducking his head under and around the bullet, as the trail whizzed past him, harmlessly. The soon-to-be priestess stared in fascinated horror. How could anyone dodge a bullet? Ulga and Tordrad leapt at the same time, a jumping attack to bring the full momentum of their weight and gravity down upon the war gore. Talarch did not balk at this. He placed his weapon's handle in a horizontal position and thrust up outwards at them both. Not only was the war gore strong enough to hold the two of them in their jump, Ulga at the neck, but his counterforce actually repelled them back, both onto their backs, each landing with a terrific crash on the decking. Tordrad's head had hit the board too hard, and he began to lose consciousness. Ulga was struggling to get back up. Dieter commanded the dog to stay put, telling him he was a good boy. Rysandria rushed to Tordrad's aid at once, pulling his eyelids open to check his pupils and whispering prayers of healing. As another stone struck the war gore, he had decided that that was enough. He brought the handle of his weapon up and round into Dieter's face, his movement a blur. The impact spun Dieter around to face the other way and dropped to one knee. Were any of these a threat to Talarch, he would have made the executioner's kill there and then. But they were not. Plus, the one who had flung stones at him was on his mind foremost. Before Tobias could load another shot, the war gore was upon him, with blinding speed. No one they had ever seen had moved as fast as this, except perhaps on horseback. He picked the halfling up by the throat, lifting him off of the ground so as to be level to level with his face. Tobias desperately swung his hanging legs, but they were too weak to do any harm from kicking. He prized his hands around the grip of Talarch, but this, he knew, was also a futile gesture. Soon his face was beginning to turn red, as death from asphyxiation was only moments away. But just at that very same moment, the beast man himself, imbued with warpstone, recognized a trace of it in the halfling too. He was just like him. How? The confusion of this made him let Tobias go, who fell to the floor like dead weight. He was barely alive and certainly no longer conscious. Dieter quickly ran up behind the war gore, jumped onto his back, and called upon the small reserves of secretly kept illegal magic within him. A small amount of fire appeared in his hand as he brought it against the alcohol that stained the armour. It went up like a match. Talag reached around and pulled the trainee doctor down and over him as the fire blazed on the war gore's body, burning him severely across the torso. He then held Dieter tight in a bear hug-like maneuver until Dieter cried out in pain as flames licked at him. Dieter would not survive this long, and this made him angry. So angry that the presence, almost took a hold of him again. Dieter's shadow shifted jaggedly, dancing up Talag's body, cast unevenly against the burning flames. These same flames seemed to bother the war gore in no way, even though his skin was cooking through the armour he wore. The shadowy hand curled up to Talag's throat, and there it snapped in movement, its fingers closing around the beast man's windpipe to strangle him. This did throw the creature off of its attack. It began to struggle with the shadowy presence that strangled him as he let go of Dieter. Dieter's skin was burnt up the left side, from waist up as far as his neck. He resolved that high collars would be in good order. A strangely calm thought to have had, seeing as the pain he was in and the injury sustained should have been the things on his mind. The warpstone shard inside the beastman's heart had cauterized the wound when it struck. However, it did something else as well. It mutated the cells of the organ itself, super-enhancing it so that his heart would beat at an extraordinary rate. The heart inside this foul creature's chest began to speed up as abnormal amounts of adrenaline surged into his system. His gift was at last kicking up into a new gear, this time to compensate for the oddly paranormal attack the small curly-haired human had brought upon him. Everything around Talag moved slower than it ought to. He recognized this effect as beneficial. It wasn't that the world was moving slower. He was moving faster. His eyes were perceiving input at an accelerated rate. The presence that strangled him cut off his windpipe. With an almost supernatural blurring shift of movement, Talag Grov moved out of the shadowy grip and roared at it with his commanding presence. The blast of this sent it backwards, flying into Dieter at once. This knocked the would-be doctor onto his back and sent him sliding across the ship. The shock of the other's presence so forcibly taken into him brought Dieter low, making him convulse on the ground. Rosandria looked about her, seeing that there was nothing she could do against the monster, with her teammates down. She could only try to save them in any way she could, but she feared that the dreaded beast-man would not let her. There was a terrific crashing sound as doors flung open further back on the barge. Then very heavy quickened footsteps could be heard approaching. A woman's voice rang out. "Beast! You shall face the wrath of Sigmar!" Angelique Rosemead appeared at the front of the ship, bearing a great two-handed hammer, and pointed it towards Talag in challenge. She looked around at the casualties already suffered, and saw again the beastman's speed, as he threw a charging marine over his shoulder and into the water with but one hand. "It ends here!" cried the plump woman, as she ran towards the wargore with the hammer she had broken free from the weapons locker. The great weapon glowed with a bright intensity. A holy radiance could be felt from it, and this made the beastman roar, as if in mental pain at its proximity. His skin began to darken in reaction to the presence, as if he was mutating once again. His fur was also changing, turning a bluish shade of colour. The wargore waited, his long polearm in a counter-attack stance, as Angelique neared him. Just as Talag was ready to avoid the blow, the Sister of Sigmar cut short her downward swing, bringing the massive hammer down against the deck between them, as she cried out a prayer of strength to her god. She concentrated with all of her strength, as a powerful zeal enlightened her muscles to a supernatural level. When the hammer struck the wooden deck, it cracked from impact as planned. A huge gaping hole that shattered downwards to the water below as the wholly infused energy connected to the weapon gave it a further mass charge of shockwave, finally released. They were very near to the end of the barge, and the beastman had nowhere to go, as the impact created fast splits across the whole deck and down the entire vessel. Without warning, The entire end of the barge gave way and fell into the water with a large splash that sent water up over their heads, covering the entire barge. Talag could not be seen amidst the wreckage in the water, but Angelique was taking no chances. She looked back towards the captain's bridge at the other end and saw him looking back up the barge in concern. She took a deep breath and shouted a command at the top of her powerful lungs. "Captain! Get away! Full speed ahead!" The captain did not have to be told twice, and within moments the vessel was pulling away at its top speed. Rysandria continued to heal those who had fallen in battle as they pulled away from the place of the wreckage, and all was still.